Okay, thanks, Erica. Well, that's the team of culprits, and certainly want to thank the rest of the team for their perseverance with this. It's been a, a very long and bumpy road. I think much longer and bumpier than we would have anticipated at the outset, and probably even a few years after that. But yeah, special thanks to John and Paul, who still have a real job to do, whereas Arthur and I are supposedly retired. But I also would like to acknowledge a bunch of people there as well, particularly Alex Thompson. I guess he's still in Google, maybe. And John's partner, Paula, had a very big role to play in the early part. And Yiming Gan certainly came in to help us quite a bit when we first started writing up. And I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support we also had from Tadwig, Atlas of Living Australia, MCZ, VertNet, and Curator. That we really appreciated in the few times that the group has been able to physically come together. It was greatly appreciated. And while Zoom meetings are great, there's nothing like face-to-face meetings to really get things done. Body language is pretty important. Okay, bit of background. So we now have a standard proposed for biodiversity data quality, which we're calling BDQ. And as I suggested previously, we've got a 11-year history at this stage of the game. We submitted the BDQ for expert review about May last year, and we received that the last day, or I should have said 2025. So we've been working on it ever since. So what's BDQ? I think probably one of the easiest ways to think of it is a framework which consists of an ontology, a bunch of vocabularies, which lead to what most people will tend to focus on, the tests, associated use cases, and basically a response mechanism. And I'll say a little more about that later, but not a lot probably. The key documentation here is, excuse me, what we're now calling a guide to the guides, which is a landing page. The URL is down the bottom if anyone wants to look at the documentation. And other guides include a guide to the framework, the test, the quick reference guide, users and implementers guide, some pretty significant supplemental information that provides a context, and a fairly lengthy, detailed tutorial on creating new tests and sort of associated use cases. We've also got a test validation data suite, so anyone implementing BDQ can test the implementation against the test data for conformance with the standard. And we certainly look towards a BDQ maintenance group to handle the evolution and issues into the future. I couldn't resist an infographic from Notebooks LM. This is actually not a bad way of putting at least the key components of BDQ onto a single graphic. While it's certainly, we've been dependent upon Darwin Core for the nitty-gritty of what we've currently done, it's not totally dependent upon Darwin Core. In other words, the framework is independent of that. The other thing, I guess, to notice is that really the guts of it is based upon a series of vocabularies, as I mentioned down the right-hand side. And I guess the recognition that data will largely be some species at some location at some date and time, just as a way of sort of thinking about the dimensionality of some aspects of the data. There are obviously other aspects as well, which are not linked to name, space, and time. In the second top, really the test breakdown into validation type test issues or warnings that flag something for human evaluation. Measure tests, which are more quantitative metrics, and amendment tests, we're called, because they're going to potentially suggest amendments to the data, which can be either accepted or rejected. And we would always, of course, stress the fact that the original data should never be lost. Anyway, that's a bit of a, oh yeah, and the reports at the top. In other words, a core part of the BDQ is the generation of standardized reports. I think that gives you a bit of an idea how the whole thing sort of fits together. Right, what I'm going to do now is just give you a update on what the review was about and what we've done consequently. And this was, as you will see, generated very nicely by Notebooks LM for us. It's probably done a better job than I could have done. Anyway, see what you think.
We cannot hear the sound, Lee, if it's playing on your end. You might need to, when you share screen, there's a little checkbox for audio.
You've got your audio turned off, Lee.
Yeah, I've just turned it on. Checkbox.
It wasn't running anyway.
Stop here. Can't see any buttons about audio.
You need to click your little arrow on the top right.
Arrow on the top right.
Down on the right of your
No, I can't see it. Let me get out of full screen mode. Just trying to find it.
in the PowerPoint, that top arrow on that slide, on the right-hand side of your slide.
Can't see it.
Move your cursor down.
Yep.
To your slide, in your slide.
Yep.
Just down where you are now, up a bit up. There's an arrow on the right-hand side of your slide.
That one?
There. Yeah.
I think that's just the next slide. There's a volume control.
Should be able to just click on that and it runs.
Yeah, well, it did, and the audio I can hear, but you guys can't, so I'm not sure.
So, Lee, go ahead and stop sharing, and when you restart sharing, there will be a little stop sharing, and I can walk you through it.
Okay.
There will be a box that says, so now launch the share again, and there will be a box on the right, and it should say share sound, and you can check it on.
Okay, share. If I click on share, right? Yep, I got you. Share sound, yes.
Yeah, let's try that.
That's it. Sorry, my mistake.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, so we want that. We want that. How does that look?
That looks good, and then we'll hope that it works.
Okay, try again.
Welcome to this explainer detailing Task Group 2's work on the proposed Biodiversity Data Quality Standard, or BDQ for short. If you're part of the Biodiversity Information Standards community, you already know just how vital this framework is. So today, we're zooming in specifically on the review and responses phase. Over the next few minutes, we'll see exactly how expert feedback shaped and truly leveled up the final standard, bringing us right to the starting line for public review. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be walking through the review team's feedback, our overall baseline assessment, how we completely updated the documentation, clarified core concepts, refined the test suite, and finally, the steps we're taking to prep for public review.
Right. Let's start with the folks who made all of this possible.
We absolutely have to give a huge thank you to our review team, Melissa Liu, Ruqaiya Jahadeen, Sophie Pamerlon, Stephen Formal, and Dag Enderson. These experts didn't just casually skim the text. They actively took on specific user roles, from end users all the way to test implementers. And this role-based approach was a total game changer. It gave us that critical, real-world feedback we desperately needed to ensure the standard actually works for everyone. So, what was the baseline consensus? Let's take a look. The ultimate goal of the BDQ framework is pretty straightforward in theory, but incredibly complex in practice. We're taking raw, highly variable occurrence data and running it through a structured gauntlet of tests to output refined, usable data. Well, the best news from the review was that the foundational consensus was incredibly positive. Reviewers unanimously agreed that the BDQ standard is architecturally and technically solid. It builds beautifully on Darwin Core and seamlessly fills a massive gap in our community's infrastructure. But there was a catch. The reviewers noted that while the standard is technically ready, the main barrier is presentation. Basically, the engine runs perfectly, but the user manual needed a major overhaul. Our mission shifted entirely from engineering to communication, making sure that technical readiness translates directly into user readiness. And that leads us straight into our biggest challenge, documentation and navigation. The reviewers were very clear. The documentation was exhaustive, but jumping into it felt a bit like hitting a brick wall. So, we completely re-engineered the BDQ landing page to act as a guide to the guides. Instead of wading through hundreds of pages, a master index now acts like a traffic controller. For example, if you are a developer, you're routed straight to the implementation steps, completely bypassing the heavy introductory theory that's meant for curators. To make things even easier, especially for international teams and different technical backgrounds, we built out highly requested visual roadmaps and concrete tutorials. Because really, who wants to read a giant theory manual before seeing how things actually work? Now, with clear flowcharts and step-by-step guides, you can instantly grasp the mechanics of the tests and apply them to your own specific use cases right away. Moving on to our next key area, clarifying core concepts to remove any lingering ambiguity. A vital piece of feedback was that we needed to front-load the why of BDQ. So we added a crystal-clear value proposition right at the very beginning. We also completely rewrote the sections on quality assurance and quality control. Those two concepts are now highly distinct. We want to make sure everyone understands the difference between QA, which is filtering data for a specific immediate use, and QC, which is identifying data that inherently needs to be fixed right at the source. We also had to do a bit of jargon busting. A major change was renaming our core term assertion to response. This wasn't just semantics. It was a deliberate move to disambiguate it from similar Darwin core terms that were causing friction. Crucially, this new name cleanly separates the metadata about a test, the response status, from the actual data output itself, the response result. It's so much clearer now for both human readers and automated implementation tools. Okay, let's look at the functional refinements we made to the test suite and the quick reference guide. For the quick reference guide, we made things incredibly fast. We slashed the long introductory preamble so you can get straight to the content. And we added dynamic filters. Now you can instantly filter by use case and test type or browse alphabetically in seconds. Let's keep moving. As for the tests themselves, the reviewers caught some seemingly illogical mappings, like why would a taxonomic name check show up under spatiotemporal patterns? Good question, right? To fix this, we formally added fitness requirements directly into the ontology. This spells out the dependencies clearly, basically explaining that a spatial pattern test is virtually useless if we don't have accurate taxonomic data attached to it first. We also tackled the reality of global data variability, especially regarding dates. Reviewers asked how we handle non-Latin alphabets or alternative formatting. Well, we updated the implementer's guide to ensure that unambiguous strings, like a translated month name or Roman numerals from 1 to 12, are handled smoothly. Instead of failing a test, they're correctly translated into standard integers, and the system simply returns an amended status. Let's move to our final section and see how all of this builds our readiness for the wider community. We did a meticulous sweep of every single document. We untangled and strictly separated normative requirements, which are the rigid rules you absolutely must follow, from the non-normative, informational examples. We also consolidated the ontology guide, so all the definitions live in one handy place, and we updated our glossaries. The result is a genuinely polished, cohesive standard. You can check out all the fully updated documentation right now at the GitHub link provided. Just keep in mind that all these resources are going to be officially migrated over to the TDGW site right before the public review phase kicks off. Thanks to this expert review, BDQ is no longer just a great technical concept behind the scenes. It's accessible, logical, and ready for action. The tools are in your hands now. How will you use these standardized tests to elevate the quality and reliability of your own biodiversity data? Thank you so much for joining us, and we absolutely can't wait to see your participation in the upcoming public review.
That's pretty much all I've got to present, so we can open it up from here. Erica and Ben.
Yeah, so I'll continue to let you all lead the session. Maybe folks have questions or would like to see examples of some of the stuff from the video demoed in other ways, or want to know how they might want to participate. And if you do have a question as a member of the audience, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask. You can use the chat, whatever makes you most comfortable.
Arthur Chapman here. I'd just like to point out that Paul Morris and John Majoric are also on the call. So if you have implementation questions, etc., then I'm sure that they can help with those.
When trying to understand data quality, where's the best place to start? It's a lot. There's a lot of documentation, right? So where do you, a lot of work into, obviously, right? A lot of thought in the process, but where do you, so I have this, let's say, I need to make a rule for a system. Actually, I need to do this, that checks for latitude and longitude decimal, just to check it, right? Make sure it's not degrees, minutes, seconds, or something odd. Where would I start if I wanted to implement this framework to handle that problem?
Paul or John, do you want to chime in? John?
I'd say the first step would be, when it's available, to hit the quick reference guide and look for what tests there are that fit your criteria. So the idea is that this quick reference guide will allow you to query on the aspects of the test that you know are of interest to you. It might be by the types of terms that it acts upon, or the types of term that it uses for input, the types of terms that go into the output, the class isn't the right word, the category of tests, like whether it's spatiotemporal, etc., things like that, and peruse them, find out what's there. And once you're in there, you'll find that there are several that have to do with latitude and longitude, like whether they're there, whether both of them happen to be zero, whether they're validly numerical values within the chosen ranges, etc., etc. And then look at those tests. And depending on what it is that you're trying to do with them, which could be a wide range of things. You could be, for example, trying to design a database where your database, you want to have constraints that don't let data quality issues happen. Issues like the one that you just described anyway. So you could build constraints based on whatever it is that that test does. And so that's just like a superficial level. If you wanted to do things programmatically, like to produce reports on a whole data set,
yes,
something like that, then you'd probably want to get into the implementation examples we have. We have implementations in Java for every one of those tests. And nowadays, if Java is not your thing, you could take one of those and turn it into something else pretty easily.
Yeah.
And build test suites even with the ones that you need for your own purposes.
Thank you, John. Yeah, one of the things that I didn't mention is the test labels, we call them, certainly have a reference directly to the nature of the Darwin core terms that you are interested in, decimal latitude or location or something like that. But there, as a part of the test, you've got what we have called information elements. So you could, as I pointed out to the rest of the team a few days ago, it's very easy to write a bit of code, which basically says, here are the Darwin core terms I'm interested in, what tests are relevant directly. So looking at the information elements of the test to map across.
And I could build my own test suite, basically, of just a series of verifications. That's great. And document, describe it. I have to do this. This is good.
So what the standard provides is a set of formal specifications for a suite of tests. And so we've said, here is a particular set of ways you can test latitude and longitude terms in Darwin Core. So you can ask particular narrow questions about those terms. Then also within those definitions is, here is what we would expect your test implementation to return as a response object. So in essence, the test definitions are describing an API. Your responsibility outside of that API is to figure out where the data is coming from, how you're aligning the data to Darwin core terms, how you're presenting that in some data stream to individual test implementations. Then the test internals say, here is a particular specification of how we think you should test for this particular narrow element of Darwin core. So is the decimal latitude and decimal longitude both 0? So particular test there. Is decimal latitude formatted as something that looks like it's actually a decimal longitude, which is your question.
Yeah.
Is decimal latitude empty? So sort of very, very granular, specific tests trying to focus down on particular aspects of quality. And then coming back from that, internals of the test, a standardized response structure that says, what's the status of, could we actually run this test or not on the particular data elements you presented it? If we could run it, what was the result? What is a human readable commentary on what we did?
Just super important. It's really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've added the link to the quick reference guide in the chat. So if you want to click on that, you can see the full list of tests. You can click on those tests and get a full description of what a test looks like with the expected responses and specifications, etc.
Thanks,
And
Arthur.
Shelley's got a question in the chat that follows along this thread. Do you have any CMS collections management system developers working with you to get this into the tools that might, help fix that at the source?
Paul?
So being one of the developers of MCZ Base, this is already implemented inside MCZ Base. And we actually have a little bit of information about that in the documentation. So it would be real straightforward for Arctos developers to pick up with it and run with it. The implementations I've written are all in Java, so anyone who's running a Java-based system would have a relatively easy time just integrating. Other languages, many of the tests would be really, really simple to implement in any arbitrary language. Some of them are a lot more complicated, making service calls to external resources.
Thanks, Paul. We'd mentioned John is still working on the quick reference guide, but it gives you a bit of an idea of what it's like. The reviewers said that it'd be useful, I think, to have a filtered approach, and that's certainly what the version you might be looking at the moment. But we know from a meeting yesterday that John's going to be working on that to make it even bigger and better.
And John's not busy these days at all, right?
No, not at all.
So so it's completed the expert review, correct? It's been passed, but you're just finishing up sort of the feedback and for the next step. Sounds good.
Yes, we've written a response document. What Arthur and I did in January was to extract every single issue raised by the review committee, and the notebook LM thing tended to hallucinate occasionally, but at least on that one, it got it right. We're very grateful for the amount of time that the reviewers put into it and the various backgrounds they brought to the review. So we've extracted every single comment and made sure we've addressed it in one form or another. In some cases, we have said, "Oh, but you misunderstood." But we've also recognized that if they've misunderstood, there's a possibility that other people are going to misunderstand as well. Right. So we've attempted to clarify it. So we've got a document which I think is running at about 30 pages at the moment on our responses. And we're probably, oh God help us, we've said this so many times, within hopefully a week or two of sending it back. But yeah, as a response, basically. Yeah. But it was a superb review. It really was. They nailed it totally. That's great. I think the framework was robust. It was very broadly thought out and pretty well implemented. We just didn't communicate it adequately. And we've basically done a review of every single document. We've pulled some documents apart and pasted them into different areas, and we've tried to simplify the English everywhere. That was a major take-home message. And we've added a few more diagrams, of course, too.
Yeah. I had this pool of people in my head, and they're going to get sent to mids or sent to data quality. Sort of big people out, like, okay, you go over there, you go over there. Like, it seemed to have worked out really, really well, which is good. You know what I mean?
Following on from what
the very gory details of that are in an issue in GitHub that dropped in the chat that we've got 21 out of 25 sub-issues closed already, and the ones that aren't are almost all minor work. And the document that Lee is talking about is a summary of all of those gory details.
Can someone take a minute and explain what TG1, TG2, TG3, TG4 is? And I'm sure you're probably exhausted explaining this, but what are those four things? How are they related?
I can probably explain that. The one was the original framework for biodiversity data quality.
Okay.
It was based on a thesis by Alan Koch in Brazil. And that was taken quite a few more steps further and ended up being the ontology of the standard. The TG2 is the one that's been working on tests and assertions. That's developing these tests. TG3 was use cases, looking at use cases, and did surveys of use cases. And these were published in a paper that we did 2021, I think. And then TG4 is an ongoing one that was looking at vocabularies, how you develop vocabularies, and etc. Following on from something Paul said there too, when you're implementing your database, we do have a big implementing this tests rather. We have a big database of passes and fails and things for all the tests. So once you implement it into your database, you can run it against this and see whether it's going to produce the right sort of results, both fail and edge cases. So for every test, there's, I don't know, 7, 10, whatever, different possibilities that would apply for that test. Some are passes, some are fails. So you can see that your implementation is working as it should.
One thing I'd add, thanks Arthur, on that one, which I think is really one of the significant take-home messages of this group, even if we didn't do much else, is that we learnt very quick smart in the early days that it was impossible to evaluate quality when you didn't have a control vocabulary of values to play with. That was probably, and that's instigated a whole set of things, not the least of it being TG4. But as you would all be aware, GBIF has come into this and is attempting at least to try and produce some control vocabularies. John might have a little bit more to say about that, on what the state of play is, because he'd know better than I. But that is still one of the major issues, and it was certainly an issue that John woke up to regarding Darwin Core. John, any comment, a further comment on that, or does it need further elaboration?
There's a lot going on with respect to control vocabularies, and GBIF is just one of the things. They started basically when our TG4 began, recognizing what our TG4 was all about, which is that a lot of tests depend on there being control vocabularies, which many of which just didn't exist. And so what GBIF tried to do was to stand up a vocabulary server that was more than just a list, just vocabulary lists of basically community ratified values. It was more of a folksonomy. So what they did in general was to look at what had been published for different fields, extract unique values, get rid of a bunch of stuff that was clearly garbage and a bunch of stuff that was really uncommon, and tried to then make a system through which the community could manage the values that were found there and map them to agreed upon synonyms or, preferred labels. And so they did that, and then they started to use that in their own pipelines to produce the interpreted values of things that were reasonably interpretable. And that remains to this day. But I think Ben can talk about other things that are happening with respect to standing up control vocabularies and the tools to collaboratively develop them.
I can. So part of, in fact, I have it. I just launched it. I had a presentation this morning, and it wasn't working at 9 p.m. last night, but I got it to work by the presentation this morning, which is always a good thing. So part of the mineralogy extension we decided was to add recommended control value list control. We'll just call them control vocabularies, but value domains, whatever you want to say, that are associated with terms. They're not. This isn't meant to be restrictive or anything. This is just meant to be a guide for people that need to enter their data. Like if they're going to go evaluate their system, they want to control vocabulary for this particular term, this is where they can go to sort of look at it. We did these as a collaborative effort within the mineralogy extension group, and then beyond that for certain terms. And there are 8 ready, and there are 5 posted. And they also have linked data. So the URI is actually resolved to HTML, RDF, and these sorts of things. This also gets tied to the Lux platform at Yale, which is what I do in my day job, which is all linked data and RDF serialization and graph databases where concepts are linked with things. And so there are terms that we use the Getty vocabulary, but Getty doesn't, it's great, but it doesn't really hit natural history collections very well. There are things like geochronologic unit, which is not in Getty. And so using this, I'm also building another glossary that actually has all these terms so that with Lux, we can link to those concepts and have actual URI with it defined, because Lux is not a system of record. So we can't define them there. We can only link to them. And if they don't exist, we got to create them. So this was created in part for that purpose. And people just, and to share these things too. And there's still some coming, but these are very narrowly scoped. This is for the, geologic sample material. This would be like material entity type possibly, or category, we'll see. But it's to get everything in one place, people for referencing. And there's a geo portal being built in Switzerland, actually kick off today. And this is part of that effort as well. There's a lot of ambitious plans to get everybody's data to adhere to control vocabularies. We'll see. And I'm sure if anybody knows about that, it's probably you guys, right? That there are lofty goals, and that's wonderful. And it's good to have a target. We'll see how it goes, right? So I still have to translate things from German and French to get to English too. So that alone is going to be an interesting issue, but yeah. So
thanks, Ben. I put in the link to the BDQ GitHub in the chat. If you go into the wiki there, you'll find definitions of TG1, TG2, etc. Also, there's all the references to our previous papers on this, which explains a lot of it as well. And also in the issues, all the tests are in the issues. Most of them are now closed, but there are other tests that we didn't actually implement, which are supplementary tests and things like that. So you can find everything there on the GitHub at this stage if you want to delve deep.
Thanks, Arthur. The one thing that may not be apparent to those of you that haven't spent 11 years on this the tests look simple, and you'd wonder why some tests are not there, etc., etc. But believe me, they're being tested with a vengeance. So the 110, by the way, tests that exist at the moment form a pretty good foundation. And if you want to know about adding further ones, the tutorial that Paul has written, which we do thank Stephen in the review committee for throwing up an AI generated first attempt, and it's a very typical example of how a group operates. Lee thought, oh, this is a good idea, I'll get on and write something that's actually more appropriate. And then, of course, Paul came along with a broom and turned my, I don't know, 10 pages into 50. But at least it's good, it's comprehensive. Anyway, there's a lot under the hood which may not be apparent, but we hope now with a redesigned homepage, the landing page for the stand, that you can turn it into, you can come at it from where you basically have the expertise or the interest. Oh, and by the way, one of the most illuminating things is when I think John ran a set of unique values across Atlas of Living Australia, GBIF, and a few others. I always remember sex. There were like, what, 50,000 variations upon sex, for example.
geologic time is like that. There's like 4 valid values, and there's 370 different values in the columns. Okay. Yep.
Yes, an old ex-geologist, I fully understand that.
Yeah.
Paul has put the link into the landing page there in the chat as well. Go back up the top of the chat. That's the landing page that will have the contents, which will link to every other document that you want to find. As mentioned, this is being converted to HTML over the next month or so. So these will look different when they're rendered into HTML, but it's all there anyway. Anybody else got any questions? We don't want to hog this ourselves.
Yeah, we can give it another couple minutes if folks have questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute. And it's never bad to be efficient with our time, so it's okay to end early too.
I could give you a bit of an example of one of the things I've been recently working on, that's use cases. In other words, it was recognized, and Paul belts me around the ears with it regularly. That is, the tests are only meaningful when you associate a use case with it. In other words, what are you actually attempting to use this thing for? So it will very much depend upon the context. The review committee gave us a bit of a belt on this one, as the AI said in the presentation. But it's certainly true that it has been a difficult area. Arthur and I have been struggling with it, mainly on the basis that the TG3 group that was generating the use cases for us generated use cases that, in my language, you could drive a Mack truck through. In other words, they were so broad, you could justifiably put any of the 110 tests that we have into the things. And that, led to some difficulties. So what I've done just recently, the AI did say, and Paul's implemented the fitness criteria, which has helped us immensely to nail down the use cases. We've actually eliminated 2 of the use cases we originally had in, and we've added a very narrow specialized one that I added in for spatial data modeling of tree species in an Australian environment. So that's got a very narrow bandwidth, let's just say. But it's something I think we certainly have struggled with recently, and that is still one of the outstanding issues we've got to nail down completely. In other words, how do we define the use case, and what tests do we then associate with those use cases? So yeah, that's been one recent difficulty, but I think it's something that Arthur and I have struggled with right from the word go.
It's worth mentioning there, Lee, that the use cases that we have are really exemplars. Most of them are very broad because each test has to have a use case attached to it. But we expect a lot of implementations. People will make their own use cases that will sit outside the standard itself. They won't be part of the standard. They can then request that they become part of the standard through the maintenance group. But overall, a lot of people will use their own use cases, specific use cases for their purpose, and they can do that outside the actual standard itself.
And the standard provides a way for them to formally say, this is our use case. These are the criteria that data would need to have in order to be fit for that use case. This is the specific set of tests that we have applied to the data. So a portion is the framework for describing how to evaluate whether data have quality or not. And that's based on an ontology that is, well, heavily the work of the late Bob Morris, working off of Alan Koch-Viega's dissertation work.
Thanks, Paul.
You were saying something about examples of what a different use case might be from one that we already have. Let me shut off this phone. So I'm going to just make something up real quick. So suppose, this isn't the case, but suppose there was a use case that said that I want all of my georeferenced data to comply with best practices for georeferencing. So I would create the tests that make it possible to see if records individually pass such tests. And then I might also include some of the multi-record tests that can give me statistics about how good the data set is based on those criteria. So I could construct such a use case and build it up from the tests that would be needed to evaluate that. And I can publish that. And I say, look, I use all these known tests. They all come from BDQ, and my use case complies with what's needed from the specifications for creating use cases for BDQ. It's outside the standard, but I followed the rules. And now somebody else can take that as a model and say, yeah, that's great. I like that, but I need something slightly more specific because my use case is for inside of Australia, and I want to use it for a grid system where I'm going to be matching against environmental variables, and I need the coordinate uncertainty in meters to be within a certain limit. So I can make use of the hard work somebody else has done with something that was more general, apply my own parameters, my own constraints on top of that, build another use case derived from the old one, following the same rules, saying which terms, which tests, which parameters, etc. Give it another name and share that one too. People could use that as the basis for building their own. So that's the idea, I think, in the bigger term, is to provide the capacity for people to build and share use cases based on underlying tests.
Thank you, John. Yes, use case library, which I think Arthur has also mentioned.
And another piece of the history there is coming out of the work of Task Group 3, we really started work in Task Group 2 thinking about essentially one use case of, here is a set of Darwin core terms that are important for people doing all different sorts of research on what species, what taxa occur at what places at what times. And so we really built up a set of tests around that very broad research uses for what organisms occur where, when, use case, which now that we've gotten a lot more specific about how we're defining use cases has become the spatiotemporal use case. And then we've got other going stepwise narrower and narrower kinds of use cases, which we're still in the process right now of refining. We know what we wanted to do, but we just haven't finished writing down the words and writing the RDF yet.
Thanks, Paul. One of the things we hadn't mentioned, which you might run headlong into, sorry, is that better?
Yes, that's better.
Is the fact that if one of the first things that we did in Task Group 2 is look at all the tests that were currently in use by all the other agencies like ALA, GBIF, IDIG-Bio, CREA, and they're all coaxed in the negative sense. In other words, they flag issues. Okay, in other words, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong. The framework by Alan Koch-Wager turned it right around the other way, and that is, what is the quality of this data set? So, what was it? 2 years in, 1 year in, all our tests went from negative through to positive. And so that's one thing you might notice when you start looking at our tests and compare them with what tests are in existence out there. So that's one little thing that I probably should have mentioned early on, which we tend to take for granted now.
Yeah, it's really what are the attributes that data need to have in order to have quality for this use.
The 110 tests that Lee mentioned, they're the single record tests. There are also multi-record tests on top of those. But our tests are not comprehensive. They don't cover everything. And there are many other tests that we started off with. Some are currently supplementary and could be implemented, but we found that they weren't suitable for global use at the moment because they might produce all fails, and you didn't want that. And there are others that we had as immature. They need a little bit more work sometimes. So people could go into the GitHub and grab these and work them up for their own use case. And we also have a template, basically a template or a structure for each of the tests. So if somebody wanted to request a new test into the maintenance group, they'd need to form it in this format, and that's shown up in the tutorial how you go about that. But it needs to follow the strict format of the test to add that new test in to fit your use case. And there are lots of tests there. If you go into the closed area of the GitHub, you'll find lots of tests there, and you can do a search through the labels for supplementary,
do not implement.
immature, and the do not implement ones. They might
Some
look
of those.
like good tests, but when you look at it, and when we've looked at it thoroughly, there are very good reasons why you would not implement those tests. They're going to be totally misleading. I can't think of one at the top of my head, but
There's one set of, well, there's a couple of tests in there, which also I'd point out, thanks Arthur, that what we call aspirational. In other words, we're really at the moment where we, maybe even things like the use of DC license, etc., might be a little along those lines. But the one I'm thinking of is annotation not empty. And that links to an interest group currently in TADWIG. What we're saying is there are a lot of situations that that I'm particularly used to, because in the ALA we've actually got an annotation set up, and I'm sure it's elsewhere nowadays too. But the point is that's an issue that we might want to flag. Someone has annotated this record, for example. You'd want to know that was the case. So we actually have a test in there, an issue test, which says annotation, issue annotation, not empty. So that's a good example of one class of test that you might call aspirational.
Speaking of which, okay, I have all you guys in the room. This is the ultimate question. We got 5 minutes left. If I don't have a value, is NA a valid value for a term? Or do you just leave it null?
So we tackled that fairly early on and said, we want a formal definition for what it means for something to be empty, for a term to be empty. And we basically said something is empty if it contains, an empty string or only non-printing characters. So, if your data value contains bell, that's not going to print. Our claim is that is still empty, even though there's, a low ASCII character in there.
Something. Right.
We specifically in that said there are things like null in all capital letters and /n that databases will produce as serializations of null values. If you encounter that as a string, that's a value. That's not empty. If you've got at the point you're presenting the stuff to the test, something that is a actual null in whatever system that you're working with, that is an empty value. But any kind of serialization of a null value, an NA marker, that's a value.
So you think NA is a valid value just in general?
It is a value.
Yeah.
Whether it is valid or not depends on the context. So
Okay,
if
that's
you
fair.
have a controlled vocabulary for some term and
Right.
you say there is a value in this controlled vocabulary that means not applicable, and the thing that you have presented to us in that particular vocabulary term is that value, then it's valid. But if it's not something that's in the vocabulary, then it's,
Right.
not consistent with that vocabulary.
Right. What else? Top of the hour.
Yeah, I think this is a great place to wrap up. Thank you, data quality folks, for bringing
Thanks, guys.
everybody to the session, and thanks to all that you participated, all of you who joined. I think
Thanks
we're
even more
safe to close out.
organizers.
Yes,
You might want to
thank you,
save
Eric and Ben.
you might want to save the chat before you close the session. So
Yes.
Yeah, we can give you a copy of that if you'd like it.
Yep.
Right. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
And
Thank you.
thanks for the rest of the team, John, Paul, and Arthur.